Okay, well, I think we can start now. So hello everyone and welcome. My name is Mira van der Meulen. I'm a staff member at Oikos think tank and I will be your host for this evening. So today's webinar is part of a series of Green Post-Corona talks on the biodiversity crisis organized by the Green European Foundation in cooperation with Oikos think tank. So recently the first phase of the COP15 on biodiversity took place. And while we know that the biodiversity crisis is a very urgent issue, there is not enough attention paid to this issue. And that is why we decided to organize this series of webinars to also foster the public debate for this topic. And this series of webinars includes 4 webinars, which each highlight a different aspect of the biodiversity crisis, as well as proposing different solutions. And today, in this talk, we will expand our scope beyond the EU and talk about biodiversity issues outside of the EU, as well as the role of indigenous communities in protecting and contributing to biodiversity. So while attention to the efforts and the importance of the role of these communities and indigenous people is increasing, still they are all too often ignored in policy-making processes. And therefore, I am also very grateful actually to have with us 4 speakers who are experts in the field and who will share their experiences with us. So I will now introduce the speakers to you. We have with us tonight Raktima Mukhopadhyay, who has a PhD in geography and who is the director of the Indian Institute of Biosocial Research. She is involved in policy dialogues and she works on capacity building of indigenous communities for biodiversity conservation and climate resilient livelihood development. So tonight, Raktima will share about the traditional knowledge of indigenous communities from 2 states of India related to biodiversity and also its importance for conserving genetic diversity and food security in the context of climate change. She will also talk about the policy and governance issues that act as a driver for loss of biodiversity. So welcome, Raktima. Secondly, we have with us Daniel Kobey, who is the founder and the director of the Ohiek People's Development Program, which is a Kenyan-based NGO working to secure human and land rights of the indigenous Ohiek community and also other indigenous peoples across Kenya and Africa. So Daniel represents indigenous peoples under the umbrella of the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity, under the Collaborative Partnership for Wildlife Management set by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Daniel has been promoting the restoration of the Mau Forest Complex through Ohiek community involvement, and he also led the Ohiek to winning an 8-year legal battle over land and human rights abuses at the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Then thirdly, we have with us Else de Meulenaere, who is the Associate Director for Natural Resources at the University of Guam's Center for Island Sustainability. Else holds degrees in ecology, biogeography, ethnobotany, and policy, and her research focuses on the biogeography and traditional ecological knowledge of native plant species, social activism, and aims to find policies benefiting the protection of Guam's ecosystems and its people. Elsa will talk about the biocultural diversity crisis in Guam and illustrate indigenous ways of knowing. She will also discuss the power imbalance caused by Guam's current political status. And then lastly, we have with us Simangele Msweli, who is a conservationist and who serves as the senior manager for the youth leadership program of the African Wildlife Foundation. One of her responsibilities is strengthening African youth engagement in the Convention on Biological Diversity and developing youth leadership programs. So Simangele will speak about the work of the African Wildlife Foundation and the importance of the inclusion of indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as youths in conservation efforts. So these are our speakers for tonight. I'm very grateful to have all of you here, so welcome. And for your information, tonight's webinar will be recorded and published on our YouTube and Facebook channels, so people can watch it afterwards. And as for tonight's format, we will first give the word to 2 speakers and hear 2 presentations, after which we will have a first round of Q&A, to then go to the next 2 presentations, followed by the second round of Q&A and conversation. So to the audience, I encourage you to ask any questions you might have in the Q&A chat box, and then we will come to them during the Q&A rounds. So with that being said, I give the word to Raxima for the first presentation. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Myra. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, because we are having participants from different parts of the globe. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you. It's indeed a pleasure and honor to be part of this panel discussion today with my fellow panelists from Africa and Guam. I'll be sharing today with you some of our experiences, what we have working with the indigenous communities in India. Let me share my screen. Is it visible, my screen? Okay. So indigenous people, as we all know, they constitute about 5% of the global population. And while they occupy or use a quarter of world's surface area, they safeguard about 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. They coexist and co-adopt with the nature, but yet the irony is that they account for 15% of the extreme poor and lack land rights, often are excluded and marginalized from the mainstream development process in their respective countries. This loss of their traditional habitats to the land tenure issues, it not only threatens the loss of biodiversity, but with the loss of biodiversity, we are also losing the very vital traditional knowledge and biocultural diversity that are so important in achieving ecological integrity, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. So the role of the indigenous community for protecting the biodiversity, it is not only for their own benefit, but they are the custodian of the biodiversity and are contributing for the well-being for 95% of the global population who are not indigenous. Now, if I come to the Indian scenario, here again, if you see in the map of India, this is the map that shows the areas where these indigenous communities are concentrated. In India, we call them scheduled tribe as per our constitutional provisions. 705 ethnic groups are termed as scheduled tribe communities, who contributes about 8.6% of the total population of our country. And they are residing mostly in the forest areas. The forest cover of our country is around 22%. But again, 50% of them are multidimensionally poor. So this the map of the scheduled tribe areas and the forest map, if we see, these are the people, these around 9% of the population, they are protecting, they are conserving around 22% of the forest areas of India, and yet 50% of them are multidimensionally poor. Now coming to the biodiversity scenario of India, as we all know, India is one of the 17 megadiverse countries in the world. And while we share 2.3% of the global land area, it harbors around nearly 8% of the global biodiversity, with over 91,000 species of animals and 45,000 species of plants. Along with this species richness, India also possesses very high rates of endemism, and we are having more than 300 wild ancestors and close relatives of cultivated plants, which are still evolving under natural conditions and which contributes greatly towards meeting the food and nutrition security of the people. In the governance side, we have these two very strong act, the legal instrument. One is the Biological Diversity Act, which was enacted in the year 2002, that empowers the community through formation of biodiversity management committees at the local level. And these committees are mostly formed. Local level here means the lowest tier of the self-governments. We call them Gram Panchayat. So these biodiversity management committees are formed at that local level with representatives from the community, and they prepare people's biodiversity register of their area. So all the biological diversity are recorded along with the biocultural diversity in the PBR. So far as on like 1st of January, we have this 200 to 76690 biodiversity management committees formed, and 265458 PBRs prepared, People's Biodiversity Register prepared. And this act also deals with the developing mechanism for equitable access and benefit sharing arrangements. Another very landmark act that our country has passed in the year 2006, which is known as Forest Rights Act, that is there to provide tenural security to the indigenous communities who are traditionally residing in the forest areas, so that this act gives them the land rights and provide them options for sustainable utilization, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable livelihood. So with this act, though earlier than this enactment of Forest Rights Act, most of the forest areas, nearly all of the designated forest areas in India, it is managed by the Forest Department, the government department, Forest Department. But after this enactment of Forest Rights Act, in many parts, people are given this community forest resource right. So the community groups, they are given, they're empowered to manage their forest areas for their sustainable use as well as sustainable livelihood development through community forest management system. Now, when we say this forest and the biodiversity, so the people, the indigenous community, they live in the forest mosaic landscape where there is a continuum of forest, agriculture, ecosystems, and other water ecosystems as well. So within this forest mosaic landscape management, how we develop capacity of the people for conserving the biodiversity, how we recognize the contribution of the indigenous communities, how we empower them, how we assure access and benefit sharing arrangements with them. That is the challenge and issue. And we from our organization IBRAD, Indian Institute of Biosocial Research and Development, we have developed a model with the Department of Forest and Tribal Affairs, Ministry of Tribal Affairs, on integrated forest mosaic landscape management for participatory biodiversity conservation and sustainable livelihood, and how this tribal culture, their traditional knowledge and practices can be integrated in meeting the different goals of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So for that, we all know as the indigenous communities, and they coexist and co-adopt with the nature. So developing the social processes that are compatible with the ecological processes, this is the prerequisite for ecosystem restoration as well as biodiversity conservation. So how do we develop the social processes that are compatible with the ecological processes? How we tap the traditional knowledge and practices of these indigenous communities, which they are using through generations, through thousands of years for conserving the natural resources. That is the focus area. That is our focus area. And for that, when anyone start any action with the community from the government department sides, it comes with a top-down blueprint approach. So people, they were told what to do. But here we are taking a different route. We call this approach as Ecochain approach, where you can see in the chart paper on the top, some ladies, they're holding it with some pictures on the top. There are 5 elements. We call it Panch means 5 in Hindi. So Panch Tattva is the 5 elements of the nature. That is water, fresh water, forest, agriculture, agroecosystems, livestock, and people, because people is uh, very much integrated as a part of the biodiversity. So how these 5 components are interrelated and interdependent with each other. So we give this 4 questions to the people, like out of these 5, which one is not needed? So you know the answer, they say all are needed. Then why all are needed? How they are interrelated, and what people can do in a collective manner to conserve them. So this is the first step, where actually, without giving any sermon on why they should conserve, we take a different route around and give them the opportunity to come forward with their ideas. And at the end of the process, some proactive community leaders are identified, and they form their own groups, and a community institutions are built. This is one of the picture from one state in the central part of India, Chhattisgarh, and these are Baiga community. Baiga are the ethnic group. As I have mentioned, in India, we have 705 ethnic groups designated as scheduled tribe communities, which is like indigenous communities. So among these 705, 64 are termed as particularly vulnerable groups. So they are lagging far behind in all the parameters of human development, and Baiga is one of them. The 64 communities. We are working with this Baiga community, and you will be very happy to know, like, all this process, it started during this pandemic period. So this digital ethnography method is used. Digital technology is used for reaching them and their capacity building. It is all done through digital technology. So then this participatory planning with the people, and understanding this fragmentation, the degradation, and their forest dependence with the forest department. Uh, then we have a different modules for capacity building for these people uh, on this conservation and integrating their indigenous knowledge. Here you can see this production, how they are producing this vermicompost for their natural farming. This is like preparation of organic balls for their seedling preparation, identification of the medicinal plants, taking the stock from the forest, the threatened species, and developing their own herbal gardens. Then you can see this community, these are the areas where people, they produce this different kinds of millets, pseudo cereals, which are very rich in their nutrient contents. These are like kodo kutki cereals, and then Niger oil. But with this system of subsidized public distribution system, now people are getting free, almost free price paddy, rice for eating. So their food habit is changing, and these indigenous crops are replaced with the monocropped paddy variety. So here again, the indigenous communities, they're involved in reviving their traditional crops, which are very, very important in the context of climate change. It requires less water, pest resistant, and this can be grown in a very severe situation. So these crops are promoted. They are having their seed banks, preparing their seed banks, small kitchen gardens. This is the like herbal gardens they are making with the endangered rare plants they are collecting from the forest and preparing their own herbal gardens. These are the local Vedas, traditional healers. they are identifying. We are developing a digital repository of the plants, indigenous plants that are there, and then developing a kind of herbal gardens and developing measures for their conservation, and developing a network of these local traditional healers to identify the traditional knowledge that they have. Here you can see these local people, they are going to the forest, identifying the products, because nowadays these are getting rarer, because the next generation, younger generation, it is not getting percolated due to the degradation. They're not finding the biodiversity and it is not percolated, and slowly it's getting degraded. The non-destructive harvesting practices, because NTFPs, nearly 200 million people in India, they depend directly on the NTFPs for their livelihood. And in most of the cases, these indigenous communities, they are being used by the middlemen for harvesting of the products, and due to the seasonal nature of the product and degradation of the habitat, they are forced to have this destructive harvesting practices, causing further degradation. So this non-destructive harvesting practices, this training is done for their collection, processing and marketing, and developing a kind of a network of the farmers, which is all community-led. You can see this is the future, how they are all these indigenous communities, and how they are taking part in digital training. You can see one smartphone in the hand of one. He is the community resource person from the local community, and he is organizing training for their group. And we are conducting such trainings from the Kolkata, which is around 2,000 kilometers away from them. So slowly this empowerment of the community, integrating women and the youth in the process for revival of the traditional knowledge and conservation of biodiversity is the need of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Raktima. It's a beautiful presentation. So yeah, so then I give the words to our following speaker, to Daniel Kobe. Hi, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I wish to thank our earlier presenter. I think she has really covered a very good percentage of the introduction about indigenous peoples, and that the remaining 80% of biodiversity are within the lands and territories of indigenous peoples. So let me just discuss briefly about the Ogier community, or rather the indigenous peoples of Kenya. The Kenyan population is people of 50 million people within Kenya, and the percentage of which 50,000 are Ogier community, where I come from. I'm personally from the Ogier community, and I grew up in Mau Forest Complex, which is 400,000 hectares. So it is one of the biggest forests in Kenya, and one of the greatest places where there has been a lot of destruction and politicking about the ownership. And as I speak about that, I'll also say that a bigger percentage of Mau Forest Complex has been a conflict between the Ogier community and the government. And that's why during your introduction, you mentioned that the Ogier community went as far as the African Court, because the government see Mau Forest Complex as a place as a protected area, as a place for environmental protection, while the Ogier community sees as their land and territory. And many of them people talk about land, and we always say it is not only land, we are talking about a territory. And when we say a territory, we mean a holistic, a place where our ancestors are, a place where we see everything in totality, a place where we have shared our territories in terms of our clans, the way we protect it as our forest, where we used to hunt, We used to put our beehives and the rest. And because today we really wanted to discuss and see that why do government feel that they needed more forest complex, is because for them, they see it as part of the 10% forest cap. Now there is another dispensation coming about the 30 by 30 biodiversity, whereby they need by 2030, a bigger percentage of it should have been covered around 30%. So we always ask, where will you get the 30%? Is it part of the indigenous people's land and territories? Or is it, where will you get it? Or is it evicting indigenous peoples as it has happened before in their lands and territories? So when we talk about biodiversity, we don't only see biodiversity as a new thing, it's part and parcel of us. Because we have stayed with biodiversity. We have said because what we do are things which protect biodiversity. Beekeeping, the way we do beekeeping, the way the issues of hunting, the way pollination is done is all about protecting biodiversity so that you gain from biodiversity. CBD talks as one of the main objectives of CBD is conservation, sustainable use, benefit sharing, as the key issues about CBD. And I think indigenous peoples and local communities are concerned and they are part of this kind of a system. And we don't see biodiversity as a new issue, but we are part and parcel of it. When I grew up, going to hunt or going to remove the tubers or wild berries, we didn't use it as we are doing it for health purposes. It was for food. We didn't do it because it was going to help us in any way. We are going to take it because part of food. And this leads us to say we have to protect the same biodiversity because we are gaining from biodiversity. And when I always tell my friends, I tell them that for us of Gill and other communities, we see like our forest as more of a supermarket where we get everything. We get our medicine, we get trees to build homes, we get everything we want for solace, for everything. Because now the mental health of people has a relation with the environment. And we always see is where we have. Now everybody has realized there's need to protect biodiversity because we gain from biodiversity. Like now we have communities who are we have conservancies, wildlife conservancies, where indigenous people are protecting it for ecotourism, for tourism, and they gain, and they realize now you don't need to kill animals. You have to protect animals, you gain from tourists, from whatever. And you protect the forest, you gain from that. Like the other day, we had a meeting with some government officials in parts of Kenya. And so one of the communities have discovered what we call a muruturi, a type of herbal medicine, which is held for family planning. And it is very good because it has no side effect. And it is becoming now the community within in not far from now, they might gain a lot from the muruturi herbs because now it become medicine to be accepted. They are going to sign what we call PIC or prior informed consent with the community. There will be some mutual agreements under the access and benefit sharing mechanism. So with some of the government, some county government. So the community will gain because of protecting that particular ecosystem or the environment they have been. Back to Mao Forest, where we are. As a community, we have now started what we call Ogye Community Scouts, volunteered by the community to protect from illegal logging, people coming to log from the same forest. So the community decided, I think the high time we come and protect the same forest. And we begin to realize that this is where we gain whatever we want. This follows some of we have come up with what we call community bicultural protocols. This is linked to the Nagoya Protocol, where the community have come up with their rules, even for those who are coming to do research, pharmaceutical companies. we need to get some consent, because there used to be a lot of misuse of what is in our land and territories. But now we have bicultural protocols, some communities, even the Yaku community in Kenya, the Sengwer, they have also developed similar community of what we call PCPs. And these have helped a lot. Remember, last year, 2020, 2021, when the COVID-19 came in, the issue of herbal medicine became so dominant because people feared, of course, everybody feared COVID, as well as others feared vaccination. So people resorted into herbal medicine. So where do you get herbal medicine? From within the biodiversity, where indigenous peoples and local communities are. Now there is a lot of processes where we are now saying to see, the next thing to do is to begin to preserve and conserve herbal medicine through botanical gardens. And this is a system we are developing. It's already working in other communities. Even as in our Gill community, we are already in the process setting up a center so that we don't lose a lot of herbal medicine, because the generational gap, as my sister was saying, the young generation are beginning not to have that concern. Now that there was a lot of influence with the conventional medicine, but now with the influence of herbal medicine, and some of the positive part of COVID-19 is people beginning to accept the fact that conventional medicine is very relevant also. The herbal medicine has a role to play. And you could see all the concoctions people are making from all types of plants, cleptas, and many others, even others boiling to take the steam, steaming their bodies, and all sorts of garlic, but from others, which with the roots and whatever we get from our forest, people started using. And we never had a lot of vital issues among the indigenous people. So we all these and the regulations which have come with bicultural protocols and the bylaws which we are setting is helping people to understand, because for Gill community, every tree, every shrub, everything, every string has a meaning, because we were using it to prepare rituals during ceremonies, during initiation. We could never do any initiation without some tree or some herbs to be used to appease the people. So all these were done because the community accepted the fact that, so you could not cut every tree as you wish, because others has a link to our clan, or has a link to the rituals which we perform. This in turn has a lot of protection, which was not forced, not coerced, not said if you cut down, we'll arrest you. The community were coexisting with the environment. Unfortunately, when sometimes indigenous peoples, environmental defenders are fighting this, sometimes they face discrimination. Sometimes they are killed. Sometimes they are being arrested illegally, or because of environmental defense. Because when we see people coming and say, we have licenses from the government, we have been licensed to cut down trees, we say, no, this is our forest. Why are you cutting down the trees? They just start saying, we have the license. The community say, no, this is our land. So this kind of conflict leads to environmental defenders being violated and their rights being violated because of that. And I know one of the issues is that all these agroecology, environmental defenders, is that we are now coming out with agroecology as I wind up, whereby people are beginning to accept the so-called herbal, or rather indigenous vegetables, which have a lot of link with a lot of good nutrients for the bodies, because health is a key thing in the environment. And I can say, we can talk a lot, because this is what we can say about us and indigenous peoples and the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a very insightful talk. Thank you. So we have We will just take 5 to 10 minutes for some questions already now. And I received some questions in the Q&A and in the chat. So a first question, I think you partly mentioned this, Daniel, but from Mohammed, a question: how can we increase community ownership during forest restoration? So the questions I ask now are both for Raktima and Daniel. So.
Yes, as I have also mentioned, and Daniel also has mentioned, this increasing the involvement of the people and increasing their sense of ownership is a key. And here in India, like we are having one program running since 1988, which is joint forest management, where forest department and the community, they are working as a partner and for protection of the forest biodiversity. And there is an arrangement made for sharing the benefits. When the harvest is there, the timber sharing, a part of it is shared, the part of the profit is shared with the community, and they also can have the right for collection of NTFPs. So this is one arrangement that has shown some very good result, where people, they are involved for taking decision for preparation of the plan with the forest department. We call it micro plan, where the people at the local level, they prepare their own kind of plan on where to do what kind of management interventions will be there, even the silvicultural management practices. So this is part of this micro plan, and then this is implemented with the active participation of the people. So if actually this people are empowered to take decisions, to identify the drivers of degradation and make their own plan on how to reverse the process of these drivers and improve the situation, and they can take decisions for its implementation and monitoring. So at all the level, right from planning to implementation to monitoring, if they are involved, empowered, it gives a good result. And we have seen like this through the participatory process, participatory planning involving different stakeholders, because in the village, again, it's a pluralism is there. It's not the single interest. There are multiple interest groups, different stakeholders are involved. So how we can have a trade-off analysis and develop a synergy amongst them, that is a very important area. And for that, capacity building is needed, both at the level of the functionaries, government functionaries, as well as the community. Especially for the government functionaries, how they will take the community as a partner with them, and for the communities to develop their skills on this, some of the technical aspects, and how these two can be integrated. So this joint forest management program in India, it has given some very good result, and we have seen increase in our forest cover in the areas where this JFM program is being implemented, and it's showing a good result, positive result. And another, as I have also mentioned, giving people the tenurial rights through the Forest Rights Act, as Daniel also has mentioned, because worldwide it's an issue that these people, their customary rights are taken away. There has been a tremendous change of the land use practices. Their lands are taken and it is given for put to some other use. And ironically, as we all know, these mineral rich areas are forest rich areas. So conversion towards this for extraction of mineral resources are at the cost of taking away the tribal lands, the indigenous communities' land, and the habitat loss and fragmentation that is causing the problem of degradation. So again here, how we can provide this tenurial security to the people. And then after, it is not only important to give them the land rights and security, but develop their capacity again on how they can manage this forest that is coming under their purview as a community forest resource, right? Which traditionally they were managing, as Daniel was mentioning. It's part and parcel of their life, but then it was taken away from them. So again, how we can develop this, integrate those indigenous practices, this traditional knowledge for managing the community forest resources. We have these sacred groves, sacred areas where the forests are, the biodiversity is, even a leaf is not taken away from that places. So such kind of practices needs to be restored and developed.
Thank you, Raktima. Perhaps, Daniel, could you perhaps give some examples of the ways in which community involvement contributes to the restoration of the Mau forest complex? To add on this question.
Thank you. I think if listener heard what I said, as within the Gill community, one of the greatest involvement is when we came up with Gill community scouts. The reason why we came up with these scouts in the part of Eastern Mau was the fact that there was a lot of illegal destruction of the forest. And we realized some of the forest guards were watching, and either they were involved or what. But the community said, I think we have to do it ourselves because this forest has a meaning to us more than people who have been employed by the government. So they practice. And secondly, with our organization, we rehabilitated over 200 acres with indigenous trees. Because one of the greatest problems we have had was planting of exotic trees, which grow fast, cedar, pine, and the rest, eucalyptus. And this one, there is no, the bees do not have, there are no pollen from these kind of trees. And so the community say, the more we have these, the more we lose. So we rehabilitated and planted indigenous trees, and they have grown. In fact, for the last 6 years now, the plants have grown and some have flowered, though others will take some years, of course. And then again, there are several young people who have come up with trees, indigenous tree nurseries, who are helping to give people to plant, because we realized the one which were available were the fast growing trees, and they were not good for our biodiversity. So, and the community have continued. Anytime they get people who are illegally, they take it to police. Sometimes they get support from police, sometimes they are not, because either they bribe or something, some they do illegal things, but the community has done a lot. And then one time the forest said, how come there is 85% of tree seedling, live seedlings, where we plant and 85% survive? Which is because the planting and nurturing is different from planting. Like some companies, they come and say, they take photos and say, we have rehabilitated a forest, and then they leave. Some animals come and they eat them up, or destruction takes place. Nobody's protected. So that is how, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I assume for this to be possible, it is necessary to have land rights and land titles for your communities.
What happened is that we have now, like the Ogia community, when we won the Ogia case, one of the issues we needed was we have a community title. The community title protects the territory more than it protects land, because land can be a small plot or something. But a territory is a word to us. Sorry, that is my own definition. And somebody should not take me for that, because it is ours and we protect it, because we realize anytime you go to privatization where you give everybody a title deed, either they sell it or use it the way they want it, or they destroy the environment because they want to plant crops and forget about trees or forget other biodiversity issues. So, but when we have a community title, there will be regulations. Those regulations will protect unnecessary destruction of biodiversity.
Yes, thank you so much. So later there will be more time for questions. And I suggest we now go to the following speaker. So that will be Else de Meulenaren. Hi, Else.
Buenas san hafede todos Hamzu. Welcome everyone. I will share my screen.
We don't see the presentation yet.
You see it now?
Yeah, now we do. Yes.
Sorry. Okay. I begin by acknowledging the, wait 2 seconds. Okay. I begin by acknowledging the traditional protectors of the Mariana Islands, the Chamorro people, and pay my respect to their elders past and present, the Chamorro people of today, and their community, their connection to the land, the ocean, and their island communities. Itautautano as one Marianas. My presentation is titled The Biocultural Diversity Crisis of Guahan, an Environmental Justice Case. For the listeners all over the world, the island of Guahan is situated in the Northwest Pacific Ocean in a region called Micronesia, and is the most southern island of the Mariana Islands archipelago. Although the Chamorro people of the Mariana Islands are one, they are politically divided due to ongoing colonization. Guahan is an unincorporated territory of the United States, while the rest of the island chain is a commonwealth. The Mariana Islands are part of the Polynesia-Micronesia Biodiversity Hotspot, which is one of the 25 biodiversity hotspots around the world, with exceptional high endemism. 3 endemic species are depicted in the lower left corner. Of the 364 endemic plant species in Micronesia, 54 occur on Guahan. Besides high plant endemism, the Polynesia-Micronesia Biodiversity Hotspot exhibits linguistic and cultural diversity. The rich traditional ecological knowledge and the traditional practices have been passed on from generation to generation, representing a true connection to the land and its resources, embedded in the Chamorro language. On the right here, you can see Jeff is carving the hull of a canoe. Traditional dances are being performed, and Arzo Amte, or traditional healer Susan, is here collecting nanasu for the treatment of eye ailments. Zycas micronesica, or fadang, is food for animals and for people and have co-evolved together. The processing of seeds practice is dating from thousands of years ago, but now only practiced by few, because a tree is threatened because of an imported insect scale and increased development. The endemic plants and the butterfly you see here on the bottom are threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The Chamorro people names of the Phyllanthus safordi and the Tuberlabium guamense are lost, while the habitat of the 8-spot butterfly, or ababang, is becoming smaller as development increases. Of the 54 endemic plants, 14 are listed on the Endangered Species Act. There are many threats to Guahan's biocultural diversity: invasive animal and plant species, militarization, irresponsible development, climate change, and the lack of place-based education cause a biocultural diversity crisis. A mega military buildup is currently happening on an already very heavily militarized island. For this talk, I'll be focusing on the live fire training range complex being built at Tailalo on the northern end of the island. Currently, 4 of the 5 ranges are being built over here, while the larger construction of the largest range is on its way. This large range will be built next to the last Cerianthus nelsoni, or Hudson Lago, here indicated in green, a critically endangered tree occurring on Guahan and Luta. The plan is to build those 267 acres of primary limestone forest with many endangered plants. Although a 100-feet buffer near the last Hudson Lago is planned, during typhoons, the tree would not be protected by the forest. Below the cliff line here are the sacred areas of Letedzen, and these will be off limits because there is a large surface danger zone that will overlay this whole area. And currently Letedzen is under jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge. Pratahila Teden, a direct action group, started a social movement and now became an NGO to protect Teden and other sacred places on Guam. For my interdisciplinary research, I studied the biogeography and phylogeny of Cerianthus genus and explored the ethnobotany in Micronesia, and studied the social movement and the policies relating to the protection of endemic species and sacred places through participant observation, interviews, and literature study. I want to illustrate how the Chamorro people way of knowing is not aligning with the current US laws and regulations and cause a decline of biocultural diversity. Although the last Hudson Lago tree is growing at the ancestral lands of Tailalo, this land is currently under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense. And therefore, the Chamorro people are denied access to connect with this indigenous biocultural heritage spiritually. The tree became a symbol for the movement to protect these sacred lands, along with the 8-spot butterfly, which is still abundant along the cliffs. The limestone forest and the strand vegetations of Teden are frequented by Zoamte to collect Amudar medicine. The original landowners have been fighting to get their land back since 1957. The Lati villages, you can see here, are still in their original place, and the caves are visited by cultural groups to perform rituals. Teden is tied to the Chamorro cultural identity and a sacred place where they maintain and protect their traditional practices using the resources in a sustainable way. Here you can see Jessica show Triumpheta umbens or Kakmantasi, which is a very important ingredient of traditional medicine, but is also becoming rare. And healers prefer actually to collect the plants in their natural habitat, as a connection to the land is important. And if people will lose access to this place because of the large surface danger zone, the traditional ecological knowledge and interlinked diversities will be lost as well. Next, I would like to talk about the political disempowerment the Chamorro people experience because of their current political status in the case of the firing range. Federal environmental laws under the US National Environmental Policy Act umbrella are used to analyze the potential consequences of proposed projects on the human development, and also to engage the public, and also to document the analysis to ensure informed decision-making. In the case of endemic species, the Endangered Species Act, here highlighted, will evaluate the impact through a biological opinion. But although the Council of Environmental Quality's guidance related to environmental justice suggests that tribal representation and involvement is needed, these aspects have yet to be incorporated in the NEPA process. It's also important to note that Chamorro people are not recognized as indigenous peoples nor as a tribe by the United States government. Since Guam is still on the list for the United Nations as a self-governance nation, tribal recognition could actually hinder Guam's path to self-determination and is therefore not a preferred option. The US regulatory framework exacerbates the military presence in the region, while the NEPA process justifies their actions. It's important to note that the NEPA process only requires a federal agency to consider public input, causing political disempowerment. The required NEPA process failed to incorporate indigenous voices every step of the way. There are several problems with the NEPA process and the Endangered Species Act. First, there is a huge jurisdictional complexity which actually discourages local involvement where traditionally people are talking about these problems. Second, the members of the communities who voiced their concerns were not heard despite all the comments and testimonies. Third, the biological opinion does not require input from the communities, yet it involves the indigenous biocultural heritage of the Chamorro people. Pratahila Teden asked to participate in the biological opinion process, but was denied. because it was not written into the law. Fourth, the Chamorro people have never given their consent to build the firing range. Fifth, the United Nations state, while indigenous peoples are decolonizing, their natural resources need to be preserved, which is clearly not the case for Guahan. This institutionalized injustice demonstrates a poor fit between species preservation, indigenous rights, and the US government as a policymaker. If you're interested to read more, you can always find some of these published papers on the CIS website. Lastly, I want to elaborate on the role of the NGO Pratahila Teden in the protection of biocultural diversity. Since 2016, Pratahila Teden provided testimonies at the legislature. Memes on social media will educate the public for what is at stake. Protests and rituals brought the communities together. Artists also play a very important role in depicting the Pratahila Teden story. Here are some of the voices of the indigenous people relating to the protection of endangered species and the spirituality of sacred places. So Starlet Cruz, she was 17 at the time, said, "We are not ready to hear that our native species, unique and important to our island, which I and most of our youth did not get the chance to see, have become no more and are gone forever." Our signer or elder, Senator Hope Cristobal, said, "The NEPA process needs to be prepared to look at people's practices, customs, and traditions to reflect the wholeness of our existence and how we treat these spaces spiritually." So many of our Manamkor elders talked about the Manhoban or the youth, their energy and the hope they instilled while the Chamorro ancestors awakened and called them to gather and lead the way. The local leaders heard the people, but the Department of Defense only considered their comments and failed to address the community comments in a holistic way and did not consider indigenous belief systems and their decision-making processes. So Dr. Miget Luambevakwa said about the local leaders that they heard the people is, the local movement to protect Litedsen changed the minds of the local leaders. On 2 occasions between 2017 and 2019, members of the community backed the legislature to support resolutions drafted by their lawmakers to prevent the construction of the live fire training range at Litedsen. Oh, sorry. Go back. But Senator Dr. Kelly Marsh-Taitano had said, the Department of Defense often disregarded the comments as if they were not substantive and can be easily waived, for example, by stating that best practices will be used, which is very disenfranchising after contributing to the process. On January 29, 2021, the United Nations affirmed violations of human rights mandates against the indigenous Chamorro people in response to the Blue Oceans Law Attorney Julian Ogden's submission on behalf of Pratahila Teden concerning the human rights violations relating to increased militarization without the people's consent. Still, construction is ongoing. But we keep on fighting, and my hope is that we can convince lawmakers and the different agencies about the urgency to protect the indigenous biocultural diversity of Litedsen and Talalo and Guahan as a whole. This is Ma'ase to all the traditional knowledge holder for sharing your traditional knowledge and wisdom, and Pratahila Teden for your continued activism. Thank you well, Oikos and the Green European Foundation for the uitnodiging. And also thank you to the universities I've been involved with and my advisor, Dr. Ikert Steffi Bond.
Thank you so much, Elsa. Okay, so then we go to the last speaker today, Simon Gill.
Thank you so much, Mira, confirming if you can hear me and if you can see my screen.
Yes, I can hear and see.
Thank you so much. So colleagues have touched a lot on the role of indigenous people, especially at a landscape level. So in my presentation, I will focus mostly on the role of youth, but also mainly on the role of indigenous peoples and youth in engaging in global policy processes. So to start off, my name is Ismangile Msweli. I come from South Africa, from the Kingdom of the Zulus, but I'm joining from Kenya right now, where I'm currently working for the African Wildlife Foundation as Senior Manager of the Youth Leadership Program. As they say in Kenya, Jambo, as we say in South Africa, in my language, Sanbonani. Although colleagues have touched on this, I will build on it a bit more, that it is known that Indigenous peoples and local communities occupy, own, and use about 50% of the land that is important for biodiversity. This land contains about 80% of the global biodiversity that is remaining. But not only do they just occupy and use these areas, emerging research is showing, for instance, that deforestation tends to be lower in areas that are managed by Indigenous peoples than it is in areas that are under different type of users. At the same time, as other colleagues have mentioned, we do know that the ecosystem services that come from the areas that Indigenous peoples manage are not only important for these communities, but are useful elsewhere. These include water provision, carbon sequestration, regulation of air quality, and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, I would just love to emphasize what my colleagues have said, that IPLCs are custodians of biodiversity. They hold Indigenous knowledge and practices that is very valuable for conservation and are contributing to ecosystem services that are used beyond the areas that they manage. Now, on youth, what's the role of youth in conservation? And I know you probably see a lot in the media in the recent years with this topic. I would start in Africa. About 60 to 65% of the African population is under the age of 25. Now, in Africa, our youth definition ends at 35. Close to 70% of the African population is under the age of 35. It's a youthful population. And of course, this comes with challenges and opportunities at the same time. So the African Wildlife Foundation works in a lot of countries in Africa. And one of the things we get from our teams in our landscape is that you find a lot of wildlife crimes or illegal activities, and they're often driven by youth. Reason being, there's a lot of unemployment. Now, this brings a new dynamic into the picture, that if we do not address the youth population and the challenges that they face, then we are not doing justice in the fight against biodiversity loss. But apart from the negative side of things, we do know that a lot of young people as well are actively working to champion conservation in Africa. So I'll make an example. As the African Wildlife Foundation, we partnered with other organizations last year, such as WWF, the Africa Alliance of YMCAs, and the World Organization of the Scouts Movement, to launch what we called the Top 100 Young African Leaders. What we got were amazing stories of young people who've started businesses that employ a lot of people. Some are photographers, some have started companies where they recycle tires and they make furniture, and some are recycling trash and making clothes, and so on and so forth. So basically, there is an opportunity to build on to what young people are doing, but at the same time, an opportunity to address their challenges, since in the long run, these challenges are affecting conservation. And in a nutshell, this is another group that soon enough will be taking over the leadership of conservation, and we need to be investing in that group as well. Now, a bit of insight on what the foundation is doing with youth. We cluster this in three main themes. It's building leadership, where we identify these young leaders and build leadership skills. I've chosen today to highlight one of our leaders, Anthony, who co-founded Tony Wild. Now, part of what we do, which is going to link it to leadership, is unlocking opportunities for youth. As part of the top 100 initiatives, we partnered with Over and Above Africa to give small project grant to some of the top 100. What Anthony did with that grant was host a workshop on the art of wildlife storytelling through photography with the girls' schools. And that's the picture you see at the end of young girls who carrying high-end cameras, getting training on photography, visiting a national park for the first time, and also being able to learn about nature. Of course, these are a few examples of how we are unlocking opportunities for youth that I'm sharing today, but you can definitely get more insight on our website. Now, the picture in the middle, what we do, we recognize there's a lot of youth networks in Africa that are doing advocacy or education work, but they often lack the capacity to do their activities. So we work with youth networks as well. I just checked in the list of participants, and fortunately, I have a colleague from the Kenyan Youth Biodiversity Network whom actually organized the event that you see in the middle, where we work with them when they were doing capacity building on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and they came up with concrete messages to their governments as well as actions to push for those. So in a nutshell, this is what we do in 3 clusters, but of course with more examples you can find. Now, I'm going to move quickly to say we've heard so much about the very important work that youth and IPLCs are doing in the ground. And I would love to emphasize that these experiences, expertise, and knowledge that IPLCs and youth have are very much necessary at the global level. They need to be shaping the policies that are happening, because at the end of the day, whatever decision is being taken at an international level, it is actually going to be implemented where these areas are and where people come from. So it is very much important that these ground experiences shape these international processes. And this is an example of how, as a foundation, we are working with youth and IPLCs to ensure that their experiences and practices are reflected, for example, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, specifically in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Network. What you see here is the picture of the websites from the African CSO's Biodiversity Alliance. It's an alliance that was founded in early 2020, and membership includes a lot of organizations from different backgrounds. Daniel, of course, his organization is part of it. We have the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network. We have the Kenyan Indigenous Youth Forum, which is a coalition of youth from about 13 indigenous groups in Kenya. But we also have research organizations such as Cordio East Africa that work in the marine space. We have youth organizations such as the South African Youth Biodiversity Network. We have alliances of community-based natural resources management, such as the coalition of CBNRM from Namibia, the coalition of CBNRM from Mozambique, and so on. And this was designed basically as a platform to ensure that member organizations, irrespective of their strengths and weaknesses, are able to come together. And because our voice is more powerful if we approach policymakers together. The reality is I can come alone as a youth group, but I'm speaking to the same policymaker. You come alone as a different group, but you're speaking to the same policymaker. It is also no secret that IPLC organization and youth organizations tended to not have as much capacity to engage in complex issues because of structural inequalities that exist, and that also they tended to not have a lot of financial resources. So the power in this alliance or alliances of similar nature in general is that member organizations are then able to work together, put their the voices that they would usually be discussing at a grassroots level, but put them into a document. What I've put on the side is actually one of the outputs that I'm very proud of as an alliance. Last year in the Science magazine, we managed to publish the paper that you see on the side, which was written by all these groups, penning down our thoughts on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which is something very important, because usually when this discussion happens, people are like, we are quoting the science, we are quoting case studies. And if some of this information is not written and articulated in these documents, it can easily be left out. Now, the scientific paper is just one example of the outputs that we've made. In our website, we've also developed a lot of policy briefs as well that inform or input into the process that is currently happening in the negotiation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Network. And I do invite you to check out those resources as well in our website. Now, in summary, of course, I can't touch all the perspectives that have come for the group, but for the purpose of this, I'm going to touch on two of the issues that we are bringing to the global level as groups, as African communities in the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance. Now, one of them, Daniel already touched on a bit. One of them is on area-based conservation. Usually when we say area-based conservation, for a lot of people, they think protected areas. So I'm going to start there. We know that in as much as there is a lot of these, they are not effectively managed. So one of the things that we are pushing for, advocating for in the post-2020 is to have a strong language that emphasizes that we need effective management of protected areas, so that we are not in a situation we are always rushing to build new protected areas, where else the ones that exist are actually not serving purpose. But another flip side of this, or maybe not flip side, but in addition to it, is that we need to broaden the understanding of area-based conservation. Colleagues before me have mentioned a lot of approaches of how conservation is happening, on how biodiversity is thriving in areas that are managed by Indigenous peoples. And the case studies we've written in Namibia also that are in our website are showing there's a lot of approaches to area-based conservation beyond traditional protected areas. And we are, of course, advocating that these take center stage as well and be supported. Now, lastly but not least, one of the things that we are advocating for is resource mobilization. For the colleagues who have seen the first draft of the post-2020, you've probably seen the targets for financial resources that are needed for conservation. But we do know that the financial flows that come to conservation are way less compared to the financing gap that exists. So there's a need to increase financial flows. But in addition to that, even the money that is available, very little of it ends up in the initiatives that are led by IPLCs, although speakers before me have shown how much work these constituencies are doing. So there is a need, in addition to just increasing resources, there's a need to have a mechanism to ensure that these resources actually get to the ground where it matters, and they support both the youth groups and IPLCs to continue with the great work that we're doing. So thank you so much from my side, and I will give it back to you, Mira.
Thank you so much, Angela. So yeah, we have had all 4 presentations. I think we have all learned a lot already, and we have about 15 minutes left for questions. So I see a rather general question by Mohammed. What are the main obstacles that you had during applying all these programs? I think this was also for Else, but I think we can, it is a question which is relevant for all 4 of you. So who feels like,
so what programs, yeah, so besides of Pratahila Teden, I just also want to clarify that there's a lot of cultural groups trying to preserve biocultural diversity on Guahan. So we have a lot of programs that try to support the healers, and even now there's apprenticeships ongoing. So Jessica was one of the apprentices that was able to learn from healers. So that's one thing that is happening. Also, the conservation areas we have on Guam, which are managed by the forestry department, they're actually providing, you know, the healers can actually go and collect their amot at those preserves. But some areas like the refuge are not always open, where at Litedzen, so that kind of when they need medicine and it's closed because it's their closing days, that's kind of an inconvenient for them. So yeah, there's some struggles with these programs too that are not really aligning with their practices, you know. So, and some of these plants are becoming really rare. And I also wanted to emphasize that when you look at nature management, sometimes, you know, you look at the big trees. It's the same with the you know, or certain you know, iconic species, but like the healers, they look at the whole ecosystem, and they point out plants that many people and conservationists actually overlook. And they also know, okay, this plant grows close by this shrub because it needs some shade. So they really know how to manage, or how to look for these species. And when they take a cutting, for instance, for medicine, they will make sure there is enough for, you know, to come next, and they will actually harvest in a very sustainable way.
Thank you. So I see another question which might also be related, perhaps for Simangele. Do big well-known NGOs like WWF work together enough with indigenous people and local communities, or are they one of the reasons why the available money doesn't flow to the indigenous communities?
Thank you so much for that question. So actually, AWF does what we call a landscape-based approach to conservation, where in the places where we work in, part of the things, of course, is mapping stakeholders that are the actors, they are part of the discussion of what plans are going to be coming up and deciding what initiatives are going to be prioritized, and ensuring that we build community leadership as well. So we do work with organizations, with IPLCs in that sense. And as you have seen with what I was presenting with AGBA, we are actually part of the organizations that are strongly advocating for mechanisms to ensure that smaller organizations and IPLC can access financial resources. Because some of the reasons why these organizations can't, or IPLCs cannot, if you have looked at grant applications, sometimes the capacity to fill in those it's just too complex, right? And sometimes the requirements for those monies to be dispersed require a lot of complex systems that smaller organizations or informal organizations can actually not qualify and meet the criteria, which is why we are emphasizing that you need more mechanisms that allow those organizations to also be able to qualify and be able to apply for those. So yes, in summary, where we do work with IPLCs, but we are strongly advocating for mechanisms that would allow them to have access to financial resources independently as well. I can take also the question that Elsie was just responding to on the challenges that we face. And of course, I'm going to speak more on the policy side. And the challenges is that we face trying to engage in policy is that it's very different, the process of engaging, for instance, your local government, than that of engaging the UN process, right? It comes with a lot of hurdles that people are not exposed to, but even the language that is used to negotiate is sometimes very complex, not to imagine that most of the negotiations when it comes down to important discussions at some point, will end up being restricted to English, right? Even though in the bigger room, you will have other translation. So this technicality, this difference between engaging locally and internationally becomes such a challenge that if you do not build capacity of your constituency, one, to understand the negotiations, and two, to understand ways in which they can engage and understand the documents, it becomes very unlikely that the experiences and the views and the practices that they have, they can be able to put them in the language that is required at that process. But of course, it's one of the things that's the strength of the alliance, is that we build the capacity of each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mangele. Perhaps Raktima or Daniel, do you want to? Oh, Elsa, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, on the policy level, also touch a little bit on the Endangered Species Act real quick, because like that act is really focused on preserving biodiversity, but lacking the biocultural diversity. You know, although they say we should try to document traditional ecological knowledge that is tied to these species, the practices itself are not really preserved. Well, and it's not that it cannot go hand in hand. If you collect seeds, you could still preserve the plant. So I think that's a really important conflict between the United States laws and indigenous peoples' traditional practices to preserve, you know, their heritage. So just want to point that out real quick.
Yeah, thank you. Well, perhaps Raktima, do you want to add a bit on this from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd also like to add, emphasize on the point of capacity building, because in our country also, we have seen, like, though we have some very positive acts, like, as I have mentioned, Biological Diversity Act and Forest Rights Act, which empowers people actually for, in one hand, for securing their land rights and under this Forest Rights Act, and also for giving them access and benefit sharing possibilities, empowering them to decide about their biodiversities through formation of biodiversity management committees and all. But what happens actually, these are all very, these acts are enacted in a very good spirit. But actually, when it comes down at the bottom level, those who are responsible for implementation of those acts at the government functionaries level, they lack both a kind of sensitivity towards it and understanding, and their capacity on how to engage involved people. So this is on the one hand, so that creates a lots of barrier in actual implementation of the act. So we have seen in case of the Forest Rights Act also, like hardly out of the total population of indigenous communities, a meager percentage they have applied for their land rights, because there was not much of dissemination of the information, awareness was not done. And even though those who have applied, many of the claims are rejected, because again, because of the lack of understanding about the nitty-gritties of application procedure and the formalities and all that. So even though the acts are enacted, its actual benefits are not percolating down to the people. So this is on the one hand, we need capacity building effort at all the levels of the bureaucracy, and secondly, at the community level. So those who are getting actually the entitlements, those who are getting the rights, they also are not being able to utilize it properly because of the lack of understanding. Like in Biodiversity, Biological Diversity Act, these BMCs, they are given statutory powers, but they don't know what it is, how to apply it. So these are all mostly are remaining on papers, and actual benefits are not percolating down. So capacity building at both the level, and then developing a common understanding between the partners, the government functionaries and the community, which is very much needed. And we term it as bilateral matching of institutions. So this public government departments and the community institutions. Their matching is very much important. How do they develop a common, they set a common goal and prepare an agreed plan of action to reach the goal. So this is very, very important, though challenging, but unless it is done, we will not get the result.
Thank you, Raktima. Perhaps one last question for Daniel. It is a general question, but what kind of support is needed now for your people and for Indigenous peoples in general? And what can people in the EU and in other countries, for example, our organizations, what can we do to support you? And what is the support you need in the coming years?
You are on mute, Daniel.
Sorry, thank you. Before that, there was a question about Kenya and South Africa, how we can involve tourists. And one thing which I can say is that people now, tourists want to hear stories about the community stories. They are already tired about taking photos of elephants and the rest because they can see in the YouTube, but they are not getting the stories from the people. So whenever they visit places, they hear stories. What is happening there? How is it? How are you coexisting with these animals or with this kind of, why this kind of trees and such like? So these stories are being told, and the kind of tourists we are having now are more or less high-level people who are no longer just coming for leisure. There are others are coming because they are learning. They are either academic or such like. What we need as communities, especially indigenous and local communities, is whenever you channel resources, you can also try and reach it to the grassroots organizations. Most of the resources we come for biodiversity come through the government. And for us to get such resources, and we are the right owners, the people on the ground, the people who are with the biodiversity, we hardly get resources. We ended up becoming people to be used for implementing government or other big organizations projects. Instead of us doing, we are being used or to do it. So if EU and other organizations can reach to indigenous community organizations, those who are working on the grassroots, I think we'll be able to see things happen. I think Mangele mentioned it very well in how the resources can be built within the communities and indigenous peoples. I think because of time, I'll not want to explain more of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. And all of the panelists, in fact, I think, as Simangele also said, 8% of the world's biodiversity is indeed located in indigenous territories. So it is very important to find out how we can do our best to support indigenous peoples, especially with environmental activists, including indigenous people being attacked and murdered ever more frequently. So both at a grassroots and a policy level, it is necessary to include indigenous peoples and local communities the best we can. So I want to express my thanks to all of you, the speakers, Simangele, Else, Raktima, and Daniel. Thank you so much. And also thank you to the audience for your questions and your attention. So the speakers have already shared their emails in the chat. Except for Elsa, maybe you can still share it because this was asked. And as said, this webinar is part of the Green Post-Corona talks on the biodiversity crisis. So we already had 3 talks in this series. We have 1 talk left, which will be on March 7th in 2 weeks. And there we will look into the connections between biodiversity loss, climate change, and the COVID crisis. And all information can be found on the Jeff and Oikos websites. So thank you so much, all of you. I hope to be in a setting like this again soon. And I wish you a good rest of your evening. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.